The notification arrived at the most ordinary time, which somehow made everything that followed feel unreal. I had just finished cleaning up dinner, the quiet kind of evening settling around me like a familiar blanket, when my phone buzzed softly against the kitchen counter. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything, but first, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another family update I'd read later, the kind that usually never affected my life in any real way anyway. But when I glanced down, I saw it was from my mother. A voice memo. That alone was enough to make my chest tighten slightly. My parents rarely sent voice notes. When they did, it was usually because something urgent had happened. I dried my hands slowly, picked up the phone, and pressed play without any sense that I was stepping into the most defining moment of my relationship with them. At first, there was only the sound of movement, fabric rustling, and distant room noise. I assumed my mother had accidentally hit record. I almost stopped the playback. Then her voice came through clearly, followed by my father's, and the way they spoke was not meant for my ears. They sounded relaxed, amused, unguarded in a way they never were when talking to me. My mother laughed softly and said my sister's name, then added, "We need to be careful about how we tell her." My heart skipped as I realized I was the her being discussed, spoken of as if I were not the one listening. My father replied calmly, "She doesn't need to know everything. Not yet. It will only complicate things." The room seemed to tilt around me, the air suddenly too thin to breathe properly. The conversation continued, unaware of me, unfolding with a cruelty that wasn't loud but surgical. They talked about plans being finalized, about documents that were almost ready, about how my sister needed to play her role carefully, so I wouldn't suspect anything. My mother said, "She's always trusted us. We just need to make sure she stays calm until everything is signed." My father responded with quiet certainty, "Once it's done, it won't matter what she thinks. It will already be irreversible." The word irreversible echoed inside my head like a bell that would not stop ringing. My hands began to tremble so violently that I had to sit on the edge of the chair just to keep from dropping the phone. I replayed the message once. Then again. Then a third time, not because I wanted to hurt myself further, but because I needed to be absolutely sure I wasn't mishearing what shattered my chest with every sentence. The intimacy of their voices was what disturbed me most. This was not anger. Not panic. Not a rushed argument. This was casual conspiracy. The kind that grows slowly and comfortably over time inside the safety of mutual understanding. They spoke about me not as their child, not as a person, but as a variable to be managed until it was no longer necessary to manage me at all. By the time the voice memo ended, I was no longer listening to sound. I was listening to history reassemble itself in my mind with brutal clarity. Every confusing moment from the past few years suddenly aligned into a pattern I could no longer deny. The sudden pressure to sign documents I hadn't fully reviewed. The repeated statements that everything was for the good of the family. The rushed timelines. The emotional guilt carefully layered over every important decision. All of it now carried a different weight. None of it had been coincidence. None of it had been concern. It had been strategy. I stared at the blank phone screen long after the recording ended. The silence in my apartment felt heavier than the voices had. I felt hollowed out in a way that was unfamiliar and terrifying, like the foundation of reality itself had been delicately extracted while I was still standing on it. My parents had not been arguing about what to do. They had already decided. My sister had not been caught off guard. She was part of the plan. The only person in the dark had been me. And I had been placed there deliberately. The first emotion that rose was not anger. It was disbelief so thick it felt physical. I had trusted these people with every vulnerable part of myself for my entire life. I had defended them to friends when small doubts crept in. I had brushed away instincts that whispered caution. I had believed that whatever disagreements we had, at the core, my parents would never orchestrate something behind my back that could harm me. That illusion shattered completely in those 3 minutes of recorded truth. My next feeling was something colder than hurt. Something steadier. I realized with a shock that I was not surprised by who was involved. I was only surprised that I had been allowed to overhear what had clearly been happening quietly for a long time. That realization cut deeper than the betrayal itself. because it meant that somewhere inside me, a part of me had always known this was possible. I had just been too loyal to listen. I thought about calling my mother immediately, demanding explanations, forcing confrontation while the shock was still ricocheting through my veins. I even imagined what I would say, how I'd corner them with their own words. But then I remembered my father's calm voice in the memo when he said, "She doesn't need to know yet." That sentence told me everything I needed to know about how any confrontation would be handled. They would not panic. They would not confess. They would deny, redirect, minimize, reframe. They were not careless enough to destroy themselves just because of one mistake. And I was no longer naive enough to believe confrontation would bring truth. So instead, I did something I had never done before. I stayed silent. Not out of fear. Not out of obedience. But out of strategy. I began to think carefully, deliberately about what they had actually revealed. They mentioned documents. They mentioned signatures. They mentioned timing. They mentioned my sister's role. Most importantly, they revealed intent. This was not an emotional argument that might dissolve under pressure. This was a plan already in motion. And what plans fear most is not accusation. It is interruption at the right place. I moved into observation quietly after that. Every call from my parents, every friendly check-in, every "we just want what's best for you" message now sounded like code layered over intention. My sister suddenly became overly affectionate, overly concerned with my schedule, my moods, my availability. She began asking subtle questions about my finances, my workload, how soon I planned to travel. Each question, once harmless, now glowed like an exposed wire. She was tracking my stability, monitoring my readiness, aligning her own steps around the success of a plan I was never meant to understand. I played my role perfectly. I returned calls. I laughed when expected. I expressed mild stress to appear distracted. I shared selective information that gave them just enough confidence to proceed. All the while, the voice memo lived saved on my phone under 3 different backups. I listened to it each night not to torture myself but to sharpen my focus. Every tone, every pause, every casual cruelty redefined how I saw the people who raised me. It also redefined myself. For the first time, I was no longer reacting to family dynamics emotionally. I was studying them structurally. What they did not realize was that their greatest oversight was not sending the wrong message. It was underestimating what I would do once I finally understood the game I had been playing unknowingly my entire life. I did not yet know exactly how it would end. I only knew this with chilling certainty. They had revealed their hands. My sister had always been described with words that shimmered in people's mouths. Responsible, brilliant, reliable, the pride of the family. Those labels followed her into every room she entered, long before she ever proved she deserved them. From childhood, she was framed as the one who would go far, the one whose future required protection, cultivation, and strategic positioning. My parents spoke about her as if she were already a finished success long before adulthood ever tested her. And I grew up in the shadow of that certainty, watching how every misstep of hers was reframed as a learning experience, while every misstep of mine quietly became a weakness. It wasn't loud cruelty. It was structural favoritism, subtle, constant, unquestioned. While I learned to be adaptable, my sister learned to be central. When she needed resources, they appeared. When she needed emotional reinforcement, it flooded the room. When she needed forgiveness, it was extended publicly and quickly. The family learned to orbit her needs without being asked. I learned to compress mine so they would fit into leftover silence. From the outside, it looked like harmony. From within, it felt like a system designed to reinforce one narrative at the expense of another. By the time we reached our teenage years, the pattern was no longer invisible. It was operational. My sister was praised not only for her achievements but for the image she projected. She learned early how to curate herself for approval, how to speak in ways that reassured authority, how to present competence even when uncertainty ruled her decisions. My parents did not just love her, they invested in her identity. Her success became their validation. Her reputation became their shield. And I became the background constant they assumed would never disrupt that equation. If I expressed discomfort, it was treated as jealousy. If I questioned fairness, it was reframed as insecurity. The narrative never shifted. Only I did. Over time, I began to notice something darker beneath the polish. My sister did not merely receive advantage, she learned how to wield it. She learned how to mobilize my parents' concern to destabilize any boundary I attempted to set for myself. If I pulled away emotionally, she would suddenly become vulnerable and my parents would rush to her side, leaving my distance quietly labeled as cruelty. If I declined to participate in a family decision that benefited her at my expense, she would express confusion about my lack of support. And my parents, eager to preserve the illusion of united progress, would chastise me for not being a team player. The pressure was always indirect. That made it immensely effective. By adulthood, my sister was not just favored, she was administratively embedded in every family decision that mattered. Finances, property, long-term plans. My parents consulted her before they consulted me. Her opinion shaped outcomes. Mine was often relayed after the fact as information, not input. I learned that disagreeing openly came at a cost I would always be made to pay alone. So I stopped disagreeing. Not because I agreed, but because I was already building a life outside the jurisdiction of their approval. Quiet disagreement became my form of resistance. When the voice memo reached my phone, revealing my sister as a participant rather than a bystander, I wasn't shocked by her involvement. I was devastated by the confirmation of what I had long suspected but never proven. She was not simply protected by the system. She benefited from its manipulations and willingly cooperated with them. The careful innocence she projected in my presence was not naivete. It was performance. The affectionate texts. The sudden concern. The gentle pressure disguised as sisterly advice. It all took on the texture of strategy once I understood the architecture behind it. In the days following the message, I began reevaluating every interaction we had shared in the past year. The timing of her calls. The phrasing of her encouragements. The almost too convenient alignment between my parents' requests and my sister's suggestions. It was all coordinated. Not necessarily with malice, but certainly with intention. They had not stumbled into this plan impulsively. They had studied my patterns, my trust, my reluctance to cause disruption. They built their strategy around my predictability. And what hurt most was realizing how carefully they had simulated normalcy while doing it. What defined my sister was not ambition alone. It was fluency and influence. She understood how to activate my parents' fears, how to manipulate urgency, how to frame outcomes in ways that made her interests appear indistinguishable from the family's collective good. And my parents, whose sense of control was tethered to the preservation of reputation, trusted her judgment as if it were virtue itself. To question her would require questioning themselves. And that was a challenge they avoided at all costs. She was not careless. She was meticulous. He was not impulsive. She was patient. She did not demand overtly. She positioned. And now, through the accident of a misplaced message, I had finally witnessed the machinery in motion from inside the gears instead of outside the structure. The hardest realization was not that she had cooperated with my parents. It was that she had anticipated my reactions so well. Her sudden warmth toward me after the memo's timestamp was not coincidence. It was calibration. She spoke with a softness she had rarely used before, asked me questions she had never previously cared to ask. She even apologized once for an argument we'd had months earlier, as if closure itself were suddenly a priority. At the time I assumed she was maturing. Now I understood she was stabilizing the terrain. The awareness burned quietly inside me every time she smiled. At night, alone in the quiet of my apartment, I played the voice memo again and again, not to relive the pain but to refine the clarity. The tones in my sister's imagined responses based on my parents' anticipation of her cooperation. The assumption that she would execute her role without hesitation. The fact that they did not ask whether she would help, they assumed it. That assumption told me everything I needed to know about the position she truly occupied within our family. She was not merely favored. She was entrusted with strategy. And I had been designated as the obstacle to be navigated, not the child to be protected. What made it even more devastating was the knowledge that I had once believed my sister to be my refuge within the chaos of our parents' expectations. When we were younger, she had been the one I confided in about feeling overlooked. She had listened quietly, hugged me, promised that things would change. I remembered those moments vividly as I listened to the memo again. And within that memory, I felt the relational fracture tear open retroactively. And I now had time to decide exactly when to flip the table. The comfort I had accepted from her now felt like rehearsal rather than empathy. I no longer knew how much of our bond had been genuine, and how much had always been conditional. Yet even in that devastation something within me solidified. I no longer wondered whether they would betray me again. I now wondered when and how. And that certainty shifted my entire posture in the family from vulnerable participation to conscious distance. I sent my sister no accusatory messages. I did not confront her. I did not let suspicion leak into my tone. Instead, I mirrored the behavior they expected: cooperative, affectionate, neutral. I asked small questions. I confirmed timelines they believed I still misunderstood. I allowed them to think the system of advantage and silence they had perfected over decades still worked exactly as designed. Every response I gave them reinforced the illusion that I was unaware. And every reinforcement strengthened my capacity to intervene at the precise point where awareness mattered most. Because the truth is, systems of favoritism only function when the marginalized participant remains unaware of the architecture. Once they understand it, the system becomes fragile. I did not yet know which thread I would pull. But I knew where the structure was weakest. And that changed everything about the way I listened. About the way I waited. About the way I prepared for the moment they believed would pass without resistance. Understanding that a plan existed was one thing. Uncovering its full shape was something else entirely. After the voice memo, I stopped interpreting my parents' behavior through emotion and began reading it through pattern. Every delayed reply, every sudden deadline, every urgent family meeting now felt rehearsed rather than organic. I noticed how often documents appeared without warning, how frequently I was encouraged to sign, just to keep things moving, and how casually my sister positioned herself as the translator between me and our parents. She framed it as support. I now saw it as filtration. Information passed through her before it reached me, edited and softened to preserve compliance rather than truth. And compliance, I realized, was the currency their plan depended on most. It didn't take long for the evidence to surface once I stopped looking away. I began requesting copies of documents instead of summaries. I slowed conversations by asking for written confirmation instead of accepting verbal assurances. Each small assertion of procedural clarity revealed just how much of their strategy relied on speed and assumed trust. When I asked why the timeline had suddenly been accelerated, my mother brushed it off as a logistical necessity. When I asked why certain clauses had shifted between versions, my father attributed it to administrative updates. Their explanations were never identical, never aligned in detail, but they always landed on the same goal. Move me quickly. Do not give me too much time to read. Do not give me space to question. The real unveiling came the night my sister slipped. We were on a casual video call, the kind she now initiated with almost performative warmth. She asked about my stress levels, my workload, casually steering the conversation toward whether I felt overwhelmed. I answered neutrally. Then she smiled that practice smile and said, "Once everything is finalized, you'll feel such a huge weight lifted. Trust me." The word finalized echoed in my ears instantly. I asked her lightly what exactly she meant. She hesitated just half a second too long, then deflected with vague reassurance. But the hesitation was enough. The memo had taught me to listen not just to what they said, but to the moments where control faltered between sentences. That night, long after the call ended, I pulled every document they had sent me over the past year into one file and examined them as a connected system rather than isolated tasks. What emerged was not just coordination. It was orchestration. The documents were fragments of a much larger transaction being assembled quietly around my consent. Consent they were confident I would give, because they had trained me my entire life not to disrupt process. They were maneuvering ownership, not just responsibility. Assets were being redistributed gradually under the guise of efficiency. I wasn't being excluded from decisions out of convenience anymore. I was being removed from leverage. The deeper I analyzed the layout, the colder my body became. This wasn't about a single account or a minor financial arrangement. This was the restructuring of long-held family assets into vehicles that funneled authority, control, and future benefit directly through my sister. My role, once active, had been condensed into that of a consenting witness. I would still exist on paper but without meaningful access to influence. They weren't erasing me from the family. They were stripping me of economic agency while keeping my emotional loyalty intact. It was surgical. And it was already well underway. What shook me most wasn't the ambition of the plan, it was its confidence. They did not move with urgency because they feared discovery. They moved with certainty because they believed discovery was impossible. They believed my silence was permanent. They believed my trust was inexhaustible. And they believed my position in the family had been shaped so effectively by years of differential treatment that I would never suspect the architecture beneath my compliance. I finally found the keystone at the center of it all. A transfer that required my signature to activate. Not immediately. Not tomorrow. But soon. That was why they had begun preparing me emotionally. That was why my sister had grown suddenly attentive. That was why my parents had softened their language while tightening their control. They were staging my consent as an act of family unity, framing it as protection, responsibility, even love. The signature would appear routine. The consequences would be irreversible. And my sister would emerge with consolidated authority over assets I had once assumed were equally positioned between us. I understood then why my father had said, "Once it's done, it won't matter what she thinks." Because once the structure changed, my thinking would no longer affect outcomes. I did not confront them. I documented. I photographed every page. Saved every version. Recorded every call they did not realize was being logged by context. I didn't do this with rage. I did it with lethal calm. The kind that emerges only after shock gives way to clarity. My fear did not vanish. It reorganized. Instead of reacting emotionally to betrayal, I began calculating how to intercept consequence at a structural level. There is a different kind of power in understanding not just that someone is deceiving you, but how they are doing it and where the deception depends on your silence. The more I observed, the more the plan revealed itself not as evil, but as inevitable in the system they had built. My sister had grown into the beneficiary they always prepared her to be. My parents had grown into the enablers they trained themselves to become. And I had been assigned the most predictable role of all, the cooperative variable. They did not need me to agree with joy. They only needed me not to refuse. That, I realized, was the most fragile point in their design. Refusal. But refusal alone would raise alarms too early. They would pivot. Redirect. Apply pressure. Collapse the plan into something else I could no longer track quietly. I needed them to continue believing I was uninformed. I needed their confidence to remain intact just a little longer. Because confidence breeds carelessness. And carelessness reveals pressure points no blueprint ever exposes. In the days that followed, I became the version of myself they expected more than ever. I expressed mild anxiety about timelines to invite reassurance. I thanked my sister for helping translate complex details to reinforce her sense of operational control. I praised my parents for thinking ahead, feeding the illusion that I trusted their judgment fully. Each performance cost me something internally, but each one gave me more time to locate the exact moment their entire strategy would require my unquestioned participation. What they did not realize was that every step they took toward locking me out of power required one final act of voluntary surrender from me. And that final step was approaching. I discovered it in the calendar my sister accidentally synced to a shared family folder. A date marked with an internal reference I recognized from the documents. The projected activation deadline. The moment when everything would be moved from preparation to execution. When I saw the date, my chest tightened, not with panic but with recognition. This was not open-ended. They were counting down. And they believed they had already secured the only thing that could interrupt it. Me. I closed the calendar and sat back in silence, feeling the timeline settle fully into view. I understood then that this was not merely a family conflict anymore. It had crossed into calculated dispossession. Not because they hated me, but because they trusted the structure of my obedience more than they respected my autonomy. And that, I realized with chilling calm, was the most dangerous form of betrayal. Because it isn't driven by malice. It's driven by certainty that you will never resist. They believed I would sign. They believed I would smile. They believed I would disappear quietly into whatever role was left for me after they finished consolidating control. They were wrong. But I would not correct them yet. Not while the critical pieces were still moving into place. Not while the leverage still depended on anticipation. Not while the trap still believed it was secure. Once I understood exactly where their plan required my participation, everything else became quiet strategy rather than emotional reaction. I stopped viewing myself as the target of betrayal and began viewing myself as the final mechanism in their design. The switch they assumed would activate on command. That realization changed how I moved through every interaction with them after that. I was no longer listening as a daughter. I was listening as the only unpredictable variable in a system that depended entirely on predictability. I reorganized my daily routines not to escape them, but to appear as accessible and cooperative as ever. I answered calls faster than usual. I expressed gratitude more openly. I allowed my parents to believe my trust had deepened since the rough patch they assumed the dinner incident had caused. And beneath that performance, I quietly began assembling my counterweight. The first thing I did was secure independent verification of everything I had already documented. I didn't take my suspicions to friends or family. I took them to neutral professionals who had no emotional stake in the outcome. I asked questions in abstract form, presented scenarios as hypotheticals, and allowed experts to explain the structural consequences without knowing they were advising on my actual life. What they confirmed was devastating but clarifying. The plan, once executed, would permanently limit my authority over assets I had every legal and ethical reason to influence. It would not remove me entirely, but it would make challenging any future decision exponentially harder. The architecture was deliberately asymmetric. I would retain symbolic inclusion while real control migrated quietly elsewhere. With that clarity, I moved into preparation rather than panic. I created a mirrored archive of all communications, timestamps, revisions, and verbal confirmations. I categorized them not by date, but by dependency, tracking which pieces required others to function and which stood alone. I began to see the design not as a straight line, but as a web anchored at very specific pressure nodes. And every web has knots where tension concentrates. Those were the points where reversal would have impact. I studied them nightly, not obsessively but with disciplined detachment. The more I mapped, the less fear I felt. Fear thrives in vagueness. Structure breeds composure. Meanwhile, my family continued tightening the shape of the narrative they intended to hand me once everything reached the signing phase. Conversations shifted subtly from suggestion into assumption. My parents stopped asking whether I was comfortable and began framing the next steps as inevitable. My sister spoke in conditional future tense. When this is done, once this settles, after you sign, as if my consent were already embedded in the timeline. None of them noticed that I had stopped offering emotional commentary entirely. I spoke only in confirmations and logistics now. I had learned the safest place to stand in a manipulative system is quiet efficiency. It disarms scrutiny. The date approached faster than they realized I had begun measuring it. 2 weeks before the projected execution, my parents called a family meeting. They framed it as routine housekeeping. I recognized it immediately as alignment rehearsal. They needed to ensure all pieces still pointed in the same direction before committing to the irreversible phase. I entered that meeting not as a participant, but as an observer performing participation. My father spoke of legacy. My mother spoke of protection. My sister spoke of unity and trust. The language remained warm. The intention beneath it had never been colder. I nodded at the right moments. I asked one harmless clarifying question to maintain the appearance of engagement. And I said nothing when silence would make them lean forward with reassurance instead of suspicion. That meeting gave me the final confirmation I needed. They were not preparing contingency. They were not anticipating resistance. They were proceeding under the assumption that the system of obedience they had spent decades cultivating in me was still operational. That assumption was the hinge on which everything rested. I needed them to remain firmly attached to it until the moment it failed. The counterplan did not require confrontation yet. It required controlled delay and precise documentation. I extended review periods with polite concern for understanding the long-term implications. I requested additional clarifications without demanding new explanations. I created small procedural decelerations that appeared responsible rather than resistant. Each one bought me time. Each one gave my sister more confidence that she was managing me successfully. And confidence, I learned, is what makes people careless with timing. A week before the signing window, my sister called me late in the evening with the softness she now reserved only for strategic necessity. She told me she was proud of how calm I had been through all this change. She said she admired my trust. She said Mom and Dad felt so relieved, knowing I was handling everything maturely. I listened without reacting. Then she said the sentence I had been waiting for without realizing it. Everything is ready on our end. Our end. The phrase crystallized the reality of something she no longer even attempted to conceal from herself. There was now their side of the plan, and then there was me. The night before the scheduled signing window, I made one final round of confirmations with the independent parties I had been consulting. Everything aligned. The leverage points were where I believed they were. The consequences of reversing consent were exactly what I calculated they would be. Nothing would collapse immediately. But nothing could proceed as designed either. Their architecture required my participation not at the beginning, not in the middle, but at the moment of activation. Without it, the entire system remained suspended, exposed, questioned, and legally vulnerable. That was the moment when preparation became resolution. I did not sleep easily that night. Not from fear of them, but from the weight of finality. I understood that after this, the structure of my family would never return to what it had been regardless of outcome. Either I would emerge fully displaced, or the system they had built to manage me would fracture publicly. There was no neutral future left. And yet, beneath the heaviness, I felt something steadier than anxiety. Certainty. The kind that arrives only when every illusion has been stripped away and what remains is choice. When morning came, it arrived quietly. No dramatic sky. No sense of ceremony. Just the ordinary sound of traffic outside my window and the glow of routine sunlight across the floor. I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to center myself in the fact that I was walking into my life's pivot point with awareness rather than blindness. I checked my phone once. No missed calls yet. They assumed I would arrive without hesitation. And for the first time in my life, I did not wake as the child they had scripted. I woke as the interruption they never anticipated. I left my apartment with every document secured in duplicate, every message backed up, every thread mapped. I did not carry rage. I did not carry desperation. I carried preparation. The kind that does not announce itself through posture or tone, but through silence that is finally intentional rather than imposed. They believed they were about to activate the final phase of their plan. They believed I was still the quiet variable. They believed the system was airtight. They were about to learn what happens when obedience is replaced by awareness at the exact moment power expects submission. The room where the signing was scheduled looked exactly the way my parents always liked important decisions to look. Neutral, professional, unthreatening. Soft lighting. A long polished table. Bottled water placed carefully at every seat. Everything about it was designed to feel routine, inevitable, safe. My mother greeted me with a relieved smile the moment I walked in, as if my physical arrival confirmed the final assumption they had all built their confidence on. My father adjusted his jacket and nodded once, already shifting into the posture of conclusion. My sister sat near the far end, tablet in front of her, calm, controlled, already halfway into the future they believed was about to become permanent. None of them asked if I was ready. They simply assumed I was. The documents were placed in front of me in an orderly stack, each page flagged where my signature was required. My father spoke about formalities. My mother spoke about security. My sister spoke about how exciting this next chapter would be for all of us. Their voices layered over one another in a practiced rhythm that had closed every past conversation before it ever opened. And I listened. Quietly. Completely. Because this was the moment they had been guiding me toward for months without ever telling me I was being guided at all. When they finished explaining what they believed still needed explaining, my father slid the pen toward me with subtle finality. "This is the last step," he said. "After this, everything will be settled." The word settled landed in the air with an almost ceremonial stillness. My sister smiled faintly. My mother exhaled as if she had been holding her breath since the plan began. And for a brief, suspended second, the entire architecture of their deception balanced on the assumption that I would do what I had always done. I did not touch the pen. Instead, I reached into my bag and placed my phone on the table between us. They all looked at it, confused. "I received a message," I said calmly. My father frowned slightly. My mother's expression tightened with concern. My sister tilted her head with polite curiosity that had not yet transformed into alarm. "From whom?" my mother asked gently. "From you," I answered. Silence moved through the room like pressure shifting before a storm. I tapped the screen once and rotated the phone so they could all see it. I did not press play yet. I let anticipation swell just enough for recognition to begin forming behind their eyes. My father straightened slowly in his chair. My mother's face went pale in incremental degrees. My sister's lowered lashes lifted sharply as if instinct had whispered a warning before her mind could follow it. I believe this was meant for her, I said, looking directly at my sister. But it came to me. My sister's composure did not shatter immediately. It tightened. Her fingers curled once against the edge of the table, subtle and unconscious. My mother's lips parted slightly as recognition dawned fully now. My father's eyes darkened with sudden calculation. They all knew. They knew exactly which message it was. And in that knowledge the room changed temperature. I listened to it, I continued. More than once. I didn't misunderstand it. I didn't imagine it. And I didn't confront you right away, because I wanted to understand how far your plan went before I spoke a single word. My sister finally broke the silence. You're overreacting, she said quickly, too quickly. If a message was sent by mistake, you shouldn't be taking it at face. I pressed play. My mother's voice filled the room first, unmistakable, casual, unguarded. We need to be careful about how we tell her. My father's voice followed, calm and decisive. She doesn't need to know everything. Not yet. Once it's done, it won't matter what she thinks. The rest played on in what felt like slow motion. The laughter, the strategy, the assumption of my compliance embedded in every line. Their voices echoed off the walls of the room like witnesses that could not be intimidated into silence. My sister lunged forward instinctively and slapped the phone face down on the table, but the damage had already taken root in the air between us. The truth had been spoken aloud in their own words. And nothing spoken afterward could erase it. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father stood abruptly, chair scraping harshly against the floor. Turn that off, he demanded, as if volume were the problem rather than content. I picked up the phone and ended the playback myself. Not because I was commanded to, but because I had allowed it to say exactly what it needed to say. You didn't just plan without me, I said quietly. You removed me without telling me I was being removed. My mother began sobbing immediately, the sound raw and uncontrolled. My father stared at me with a fury that could not disguise fear. My sister stood as well now, color draining from her face as if she had finally realized the illusion of control had evaporated entirely. You recorded us, she accused, desperate to redirect blame. I didn't need to, I replied. You recorded yourselves. The documents on the table had not moved. The pen lay untouched where my father had placed it. For the first time, the authority they represented felt hollow, ornamental, secured by a consent that would never arrive. I gathered the stack of pages calmly, flipped through them one final time, and then slid them back across the table without signing a single line. I will not authorize a plan built on deception, I said. And I will not volunteer my future to people who decided I was expendable before I was even informed. My father's voice cracked as he tried to regain control. You're being emotional, he said. This is business. No, I replied. This was business when you decided not to tell me the truth. Now it's consequence. My sister tried a different tactic. Tears ready now, voice trembling with carefully sculpted vulnerability. We did this to protect you, she whispered. You don't understand what could have happened if I had known. I finished for her. You were afraid of what I might choose. So you removed choice entirely. That was the moment the last illusion died. My mother reached for me, collapsing into apologies that came too late to stabilize anything. My father spoke in clipped fragments, alternating between justification and bargaining. My sister's composure disintegrated into open panic as she realized the future she had already begun living in her mind was now suspended in legal and moral purgatory. Every axis they had aligned now tilted at once. I stood, collected my phone and slid my bag over my shoulder. I won't expose you, I said. You've already done that yourselves. Then I walked out. Not in silence. Not in anger. In closure. In the days that followed, the plan dissolved under its own documentation. Deadlines expired. Transfers failed to activate. Oversight bodies began asking questions no one could comfortably answer. My parents attempted reconciliation through intermediaries. My sister tried once more to regain control through pressure disguised as apology. I did not engage. The structure they had built required my cooperation to complete itself. Without it, every strand now hung visible and contested. They never admitted publicly what the voice memo contained. They didn't need to. Their sudden reversals, abandoned timelines, and retracted authority spoke louder than confession ever could. People who observe power recognize its fractures long before they understand its origins. As for me, I did not celebrate. I stabilized. I reorganized my life the way one does after discovering they had been living on ground that was never truly theirs. I renegotiated every boundary, repositioned every expectation, redefined what family would mean from that moment forward, not as an obligation to absorb manipulation, but as a relationship that required honesty to exist at all. My parents write now. Cautiously. Respectfully. My sister does not. And for the first time, that silence does not haunt me. Because silence, when chosen, is no longer erasure. It is independence. They never knew I heard the message when they recorded it. They never expected their own voices to become the trigger that dismantled the system they spent years perfecting. They believed secrecy was their weapon. They forgot that sound travels further than intention. And once it does, it cannot be called back. If this story moved you, shocked you, or made you feel seen, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful family betrayal and secret exposed revenge stories every week.